Welcome to the Common Man Football Show. My name is James Cobern, and today's episode, we're going to be talking about NFL preseason data. The NFL preseason is over, the actual NFL season is here, and I figured I would make a video about NFL preseason data in terms of does it matter? Does the NFL preseason matter? Is the NFL preseason predictive? And all this other kind of information. And what can you actually take from NFL preseason data, which I think is the biggest sort of thing I want you guys to kind of take away from this video. And just to start out, I will say this: NFL preseason data does not really matter as much as actual NFL data, and of course what they did in college and their athleticism. Like, those things are much better in terms of correlation. There's less variables affecting things. I mean, the biggest issue with preseason data in general is the amount of variables you have to account for. One, not all the starters are probably playing in these games. You're playing third stringers, you're playing second stringers. They're bussing first stringers and second stringers in and out during the game. Players are injured. Some players might get injured. Some players may not play. Some coaches may not call certain plays. Most of the time, the defenses are only playing man. They're not playing, zone a lot of times. Very sort of vanilla defenses just to kind of, test stuff out. So NFL preseason is not something to where you should make sweeping conclusions about in terms of data, but there are some things. And the basic way to kind of explain what the data says about preseason is that on average, if you want to be an above average quarterback, if you want to be an above average running back or an above average wide receiver, or even an above average tight end, you typically want to do a little bit better in preseason than everybody else. For the most part, on average, quarterbacks who have really good seasons typically perform a little bit above average compared to other quarterbacks who don't perform well in the preseason. And then really just becomes a thing about putting on the film and actually watching the game. And that's the biggest thing about this is I think preseason data is a decent tool in terms of seeing, okay, who performed well, and then going to watch those players who didn't perform well, go watch those players to see why they aren't performing well. I think that's the sort of best way to kind of explain how to use preseason data, but I don't think it's something that should be used for predictions. I don't think it's something for you to make sweeping conclusions upon. But at the same time, I do think it is interesting just to talk about the players who did perform well in terms of preseason data, especially when it comes to the offensive positions, and then kind of get into what this might mean for them potentially. Again, it could be a good sign, it could be a bad sign. A lot of times when it comes to preseason and your rookies, because that's who we're talking about is the rookie class, if you perform well in preseason, or at least you don't stink, that could be an indicator of certain things. Potentially. Like, it's basically just a sort of old adage, like, if you're just god-awful in preseason, if you're just terrible in preseason, then the likelihood of you becoming really successful in the actual NFL season is a little, less likely. It could still happen because, again, it's preseason. There's so many variables that affect things. But at the same time, I just kind of want to get this out there. Just basically how did the rookies perform in preseason? Sort of the methodology there, and then just give my final 2 cents on the rookie class as a whole going into the season. So starting with the quarterbacks. So this is all of the quarterbacks in terms of quarterback data when it comes to preseason, and for the most part, a lot of preseason quarterbacks played well. And I know this might be setting things up too much, but for the most part, there was a lot of preseason quarterbacks that performed well in terms of rookies in preseason. Of course, I based on the data that I did. Attempts is just the amount of attempts they had compared to everybody since 2010. PCT is completion percentage. Average is average yards per play. Quarterback rating is rate. First down conversion rate is basically that first percentage. 20 plus yards percentage, which is basically the number of 20 plus yard plays per attempts you had, the number of 40 plus yard plays in terms of attempts you had, the number of sacks you took based on the attempts you had, number of TDs you had based on the attempts you had, and of course the interceptions in terms of the attempts that you had. So that's basically what all this data is. And when you look at the rookie class, I mean, the big ones who performed the best was Cooper Rush had a very good preseason overall, very good completion percentage, very good quarterback rating. Kyle Slaughter, of course, performed very well in the preseason as a rookie. Patrick Mahomes performed really well in the preseason as a rookie. Mitchell Trubisky, C.J. Beathard, and Brad Kaya. Those were the guys that in preseason, again, it's preseason, but those guys performed relatively well. Quarterbacks who didn't do so well: Nathan Peterman, Davis Webb, Deshaun Kaiser, basically everybody below that. I think the big ones, just to point out, like Deshaun Watson didn't have the best preseason, who kind of was in the same boat as Kaiser in terms of what they did. And then when you actually look at the chart, so this is the basic data chart. So when you look at the basic data chart when it comes to NFL QBR, the two big ones that I think you should focus on when you look at those charts, so you can pause this video and go back to that other part if you want. But the biggest thing is just you want a relatively above average completion percentage, and you want a relatively above average quarterback rating when it comes to your preseason performance. If you want to have a quarterback who has a above average QBR versus a below average QBR, and that has basically been how the statistics have pointed. Now, does this mean that all the quarterbacks who didn't perform well, like Deshaun Watson or Deshaun Kaiser, are just going to have terrible NFL seasons or below average QBR? Yes and no. I mean, it could be an indicator of that. It could not be an indicator. It's preseason. There's so many variables that affect things. But I do think that when you just, it's a good baseline. It's a good way to kind of look at things and to go back and watch the film. So if a guy looked good or performed well, go back and watch the film and see what they did in those kind of situations. So that's the basic thing that you can take away from the quarterback performances. Then we get to running backs. The best running backs who performed in preseason were Alvin Kamara, Donta Foreman, D'Angelo Henderson, Marlon Mack, and Corey Clement. And there was a bunch of other guys like Chris Carson. I know he's getting a lot of buzz in Seattle. Aaron Jones from Green Bay also had a fairly decent preseason as well. Christian McCaffrey, of course, Kareem Hunt. All those guys pretty much had pretty good preseasons. Guys who did not have the best preseason, Jeremy McNichols is probably a guy who was pretty much below average in terms of every sort of metric. He, of course, got cut by the Bucs recently. But other big guys like P. Ryan, Jamal Williams, in terms of big names for running backs, they also didn't have very good preseason performances as well. So again, you can pause the video and look at this sort of data at your leisure, and then this is where the actual things stack up when it comes to running backs. So running backs that hit 90 plus percentile production, 80 plus percentile production, 50 plus percentile production, or 50 or less, which is basically backup status. This is how they typically performed in preseason on average. And if you look at it, it just, if you're a little bit above average in terms of these particular data points, then there's a better chance of you potentially becoming an above average running back when it comes to these sort of data points. So again, potentially, it's preseason. Again, don't go too crazy with it because of all the variables that can affect things. And then, of course, we get to the wide receivers. For the most part this preseason, wide receivers who had very good preseasons were Josh McGee, Isaiah McKenzie, Tim White, Justice Liggins, Josh Reynolds had a really good preseason as well. D.D. Westbrook played a lot of snaps and also had a very good preseason overall. He's probably, if you think of like, a guy who had a ton of snaps in terms of receptions, a ton of receptions, and also performed really well in terms of everything, that'd be D.D. Westbrook. So he's probably one of the guys who did that. But again, you could pause this video and look at all this data at your leisure. And then, of course, this is where the percentages stack up. Not as big of a disparity when it comes to wide receiver data, when it comes to the averages, in terms of below average season, above average season. But there still is some of a correlation that if you do a little bit better in terms of average, first down completion, and all that other kind of data, then there might be a better chance. Like there's a slightly better chance of you becoming a good sort of wide receiver if you get an opportunity, if you performed above average in terms of preseason, at least above average when it comes to these particular data points. But again, it's preseason. It's preseason, guys. So don't go too crazy. But I just kind of want to get this data out there so people can see it. And then, of course, we get to the tight ends. Tight ends had pretty good preseason performances. Cole Hikatini, Ricky Seals-Jones, Bucky Hodges, Evan Ingram, George Kittle, Jacob Hollister, O.J. Howard, David Njoku, and then, of course, the rest of the guys are on the list for them. And then, of course, this is kind of the breakdowns when it comes to 90 plus, 80 plus, 50 plus, etc., and, of course, 50 or less. So, typically speaking, for tight ends, you want to get about 58-ish, when it comes to, average, first down completion, 10, TD, etc. So, you just want to be a little bit above average, when it comes to that, and you might be able to hit some of these higher sort of income stuff. Again, the biggest determiner of these higher income factors really just comes down to all the other stuff, in terms of, your athleticism and your college production and all that kind of stuff. So, a lot of those other variables affect things a lot better than preseason. If you just went with those other variables versus preseason, you would get more players hit, essentially, in terms of predicting sort of success. But I do think it's just kind of interesting just to see, that preseason is not the best predictor ever, but if you do well in preseason, it could be indicative of good things, potentially, and that's the biggest sort of takeaway that I could possibly give to you guys when it comes to preseason data, is it's not the end-all be-all. It's not something that you should make huge decisions about, but it is something to where you can look at it and go, okay, these guys performed above average. Let me go to the film and see what they did, see what the circumstances were, see what the context was in which they performed, and then make my ultimate decision based on that kind of information. So again, I just wanted to get this stuff out there. It's not something to be taken 100% seriously, but I did want to do a preseason video because the season, the NFL season's almost here. It is a question I usually get asked a lot about preseason is, what matters, what doesn't matter, all that kind of stuff. And again, there is some slight correlations, but it's not enough to make a sweeping decision about it. But I do think it's kind of interesting to look at all this stuff and to go back and look and see how outcomes showed up and all that kind of stuff. So again, my name is James Cobern. You can find my other work at draftcoburn.wordpress.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Geometrics. And if you like this content and you want more content like this, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Share this video as well with anybody that you know, and I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Peace.